brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
So we are on episode 47 of our podcast, and we're still talking about the Nartic epic stories of the Caucasus. We'll be talking about some of the same characters, but I would like to do a general overview of the different themes and then show you some of the differences and the perception of these particular heroes in different peoples of Caucasus. So the peoples today we're going to be talking about, let me pull up a map of Caucasus really quickly. Here we have the map of Caucasus so that we know a little bit about what areas we're going to be talking about, and English people again are not there. Let me see. Yeah, they are. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about the following populations. Now we've talked about Ossetian epic tales because that's kind of at the core of what's been studied. And that's the people right here in yellow. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the Abkhazian story here. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the English people right here, and that's this green, striped green color. We're going to be talking about people in Chechnya, and a very tiny bit about people in this region, which is Karachaevo-Cherkessia region, and also Kabardino-Balkaria region. We're going to be talking about mostly these areas of Caucasus that are not the major peoples. And another area that we're going to be talking about, and it's not really separated here, but this is the Adyghe people. Adyghe people are also known as the Cherkess people. Now, don't let this confuse you, because you see there's Cherkessia here. Well, Cherkess is what the Adyghe people have been called, or Adyghe is what they call themselves. Cherkess is what various Turkic-speaking people were calling these tribes. So that's why this republic, for example, is named Karachaevo-Cherkessia, but that's just an administrative title. The Adyghe is the republic, but basically it's Cherkess people related to Cherkess people that live in this region. So we're going to be talking a lot about these people. And these people are fairly closely tied to the Abkhazian peoples, even though nowadays they have kind of spread out. And we've talked about the Dagestani people, who have not a central epic story of the Narts peoples, but they have some echoes in their fairy tales and folklore. And in their view, the Narts are no longer the noble heroes or the forefathers. They've become the actual kind of questionable, bigger than life, gigantic, potentially monsters, and not very advisable to be followed around as far as their actions and their deeds figures. So storyline, that is a couple interesting themes. We've talked about many of them, but I will want to first of all talk about some of the very major ones, and the ones that are the most archaic ones that I think are extremely interesting. First of all, that's the and we're just going to label these themes, and then we're going to remember them and come back to them as we discuss differences between different people's perception and nuances between different people's telling of the story. So there's the issue of totems, of totemic animals, and a lot of these stories, there's a wolf. Wolf is mentioned one way or another, and it seems that wolf, just like with a lot of other subgroups, wolf is considered to be an ancestral animal, and there's a really good theory on why that may be the case. But it is a totemic animal for the people of Caucasus. Anywhere, I mean, for example, Chechen people directly consider the wolf to be related to them. The theme of the wolf, or having to use, for example, wolf's milk to conduct a ritual, the theme of having to share with the wolves becomes very important. So the totem, the totemic theme as a whole, and the idea of the wolf as a totem of the peoples is very central to a lot of these legends. Another totemic entity that is particularly defined in the Adyghe area, Cherkessia region. Cherkessia is the administrative unit. That the gay people are the ones who live there. Either one of the terms is correct. That one is more administrative and the other one is more ethnic, technically, even though they're kind of oftentimes used interchangeably. There's a very much the subject of trees and sacred tree groves. Now we remember that in Gilgamesh, in archaic Greek stories, even in Roman stories, I mean in Celtic stories, there's always the subject of trees being the sacred place. There's the issue of the trees being the ancestor. There's the issue of the tree as being the place that connects you between the worlds, and it's also the place that is related to the spirits of the dead, communication with the ancestors, all kinds of ritual practices from fertility to burial practices. The tree seems to be very symbolic. Now, different peoples, of course, have different trees that they associate with most. For example, everybody knows that Russians and the birch tree are very much seem to be very tied together. In the British Isles, it was oftentimes the oak tree that was the central to their culture, and so on and so forth. Well, it seems that the fruit trees were very essential to very early version of some of these practices. And again, we will come back. So that's the totemic theme. Those are the subjects of the totems that come up pretty clearly. Other subjects that come up that seem to unite this entire cycle of stories. Now, we've talked about more modern things. Right now, I'm talking about more archaic things. Is the idea of a hero that is, in one way or another way, is invincible, and that is somehow connected with the magic of metal. In some stories, it is just iron. In some stories, it is steel. But that shows us that connection was very archaic wonderment and the magical properties of anything that is has to do with metallurgy. When metallurgy was first discovered and started getting widely used by peoples, especially at the very first phases, metallurgy, just the concept of taking this basically rocks, right, and turning them into a sword or into a tool was very magical. And the idea that this was a really hard substance, this was a very protective substance, it is something that is essential to a lot of peoples, and that's why the idea of being invincible hero that is partially made out of metal is something that is very archaic and we see that in other epic stories across the world, but in these stories it's particularly well defined because a couple of the main characters, one way or another, either have metal body parts or they described as made of steel. And at the same time, even though this whole idea of an invincible hero continues. For example, with the Greeks, with their story of Achilles, we see the kind of conversations, echoes of the same storylines. Achilles' story loses that element of the metal as being a part of his invincibility, to where here the idea of that you take your hero and you literally treat your hero as a piece of metal, and you literally make out of the hero a sword. Basically, you take a human and make a hero out of this otherwise not perfect entity. That's something that is very present in all of these stories and seems to be very essential. Another idea that seems to be very essential to all of these stories is that the Narts, whether or not they're viewed as our direct ancestors or godlike creatures or potentially foreign and hostile creatures, nonetheless, the Narts are mortal. The Narts live on the earth for X amount of time, and then the Narts have to exit. And so the theme of the death of the Narts is something that is common to all these cycles. And of course, there's the one Nart hero who is a Nart and yet not a Nart, because on the one hand, she fits within the kind of genealogy of the Nartic groups, but on the other token, she seems to be standing outside of that, and that is, of course, the mother, or the Satana, or Shatana, that has other names with other different peoples, but she is inevitably the wise advisor to all the Nartic people. She is inevitably the adopted mother. She is oftentimes her and Urzumag, and those are the Setian names for these peoples. Again, every group has their own names, but the heroes are pretty much the same. They don't have children of their own, or children of their own they do have, and then they're doomed to die. But bottom line is, she is a proverbial mother to everyone. She's the one who raises all the heroic Nards. She's the one who is the ultimate woman and the ultimate mother figure, and she's also very heavily associated with some facets of the mother goddess cult. Because she's associated with domestication of animals, she's associated with introduction of various items, for example, like the loom, needle, the thimble, alcohol, beer, wine is oftentimes associated with her. The invention of domestication of plants is oftentimes associated with the mention of her. Oh, again, another concept is that there are monsters out there. The idea of these monsters living around us. If we think to much more familiar Greek tales, Greek epic stories, in Greece, the heroes who are half human, half gods, which is kind of an echo with the Narts, even though the Narts, only some of them are directly descendant from the gods, And in Greek stories, all the heroes descended from the gods. Well, the Greeks' heroes' primary job was to clean up the earth from the remnants of these pre-creation monsters, these monstrosities that for one reason or another were either born or accidentally made by gods, or were made by gods not accidentally, but without using much good thinking. The idea is that we have space, a continuum of space around us, forests, valleys, mountains, sky, and the waters, where monstrous and hostile to human beings things exist, and we need to suppress them, we need to subdue them, we need to acculturate them in order to make the space safe and livable for human beings, which is also a very, very archaic concept. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody else has anything they want to jump in with.
I know some native cultures have totem animals, and the shamans, some of them can turn into these animals in their lore. Is this the same in the Caucasus?
It's echoes, because the shamanic lore has long since gone by the time these epic stories were beginning to be composed. But that echo of the memory, just like you will see in Mongolian legends, you will see it in a lot in Russian and Slavic and Germanic folklore, this concept of being able to either change into a wolf or having to wear wolf skin or other animal, depending on what the totemic animal is. The idea that, for example, remember when we were talking about the shamanistic approach, that the idea that you cannot cut down a random tree because you might cut down your wife in the process because it's her totemic twin or her totemic connection. In that sense, it is derived from the same shamanistic, very traditional approach, but it has been rethought, reevaluated, reprocessed within the mentality of the peoples who are talking about it. And so it becomes almost like a fantastical fairy tale element, but the echoes of that memory is there. So about the monsters, in this case, it's usually giants, dragons, and or some kinds of wild beasts. Occasionally it's bad people or bad gods, or for example, things that are unseemly, such as cyclops, such as human, various cannibalistic entities, usually monsters, cannibalistic families, tribes, and then there's the idea. So all these things are generally giant. They are considered to be by definition bad, not good. And the hero, the Narts, usually their primary function, really, besides having families and drinking and partying and going to war one against another and conquering surrounding lands and getting rich and pillaging and basically just being very brave and exciting heroes. I mean, their primary actual job in these stories is always to combat these hostile to humans things. And then now these things are not gods. I just want to be very clear. They're not at all divine, because there are such, in some versions of the folklore, there are divine creatures. In some version of the folklore, the Narts themselves seem to be semi-divine, but they're all gigantic, they're all monstrous, and they're all by definition bad. And again, I've mentioned it before, but in several of these traditions, not within the Nartic epic stories themselves, but the tales, the legends, the fairy tales that kind of circled on around them, there is an additional idea of small peoples, and they're called different names, but they're very similar to dwarfs. They're the peoples who are most often associated with the dolmens, those little burial structures that we have looked at. If you need me to refresh your memory, I can pull up those pictures. But anyway, so these peoples are not generally considered to be hostile to humans. They're just others. They're very much like humans. They're very much like the Narts. They're just different in stature, but they can be good and bad, and you can negotiate with them. And in some of the stories, the Narts have familiar relationships with them, as in like blood bonds and various intermarriages. And there's some researchers who just some researchers hopefully think the idea that dwarves and trolls and like in some of the European folklore may be distant memory of the Neanderthals. Some people think that these small diminutive people who always associated with the construction of the dolmens may be actual ancestral memory of the peoples who actually lived there, the culture of the dolmen builders. And it's just a tantalizing thing to think about, which makes you wonder if they're gigantic humanoid forms. I'm not talking about the dragons and other weird beast-like creatures, but if the giant humanoid forms, various cannibalistic man-eating monsters, whether or not there may be even a distant memory of fearing the other kind of human, the other tribe, or even another human species that may have been hostile when the humans of Homo sapiens sapiens first came to that region and had to clear the space from remnants of maybe more archaic populations there. I mean, this is utterly unscientific, but it is a tantalizing thought. I always find it interesting to think about.
Well, I have to say, I think when it comes to, like, say, the hobbits of the Tolkien's books, we want them to be real, for sure. And actually, the story of like a cannibalistic, threat, tribe, that kind of reminds me of the story of the, if I'm pronouncing it right, the Wendigo, the cannibalistic monster in Native American stories. So another echo, perhaps.
No, I'm just kind of curious. It's kind of a chicken and egg. What came first question, and that is, it seems to a lot of their mythology defines how they interact with their natural world around them, and or perhaps defines how they conduct their interactions, but also kind of how it shaped them.
Right.
And so that's kind of an open-ended chicken and egg question, and very much of like how they engaged and saw. It seems like they saw this, what at the time would be a wilderness around them, as a potentially very hostile place.
Right, and I think that's true about all early human societies. I mean, even as far along as medieval Europe, late medieval Europe. I mean, heck, Victorian and 19th century Russian villages. I mean, the environment was very hostile. It was not unlikely to have a pack of wolves in the winter or a hungry bear come into a village and eat half the population there.
Do you think they coexisted with giant cave bears and scimitar cats and things like that, and they would have a stick?
Right. Well, and I'm sure they did. I mean, everybody coexisted with them at some point in time, right? I mean, so like I said, this is just an interesting thing to debate and think about. So we're going to talk about some of the components. Now, we're going to do a lot of the talking about the Adig people today, but I want to also talk about the Chechen and Gush peoples. And so Chechen and Gush peoples, for that, I mean, again, for all the for all the groups, I don't want to call them tribes because they'll take severe offense. But they were, I mean, at one point in time, these people were obviously tribes. I mean, now they're nations. They're nations that have multiple ethnicities and linguistic groups within their own nation. They're republics. They're not very large nations, but nonetheless, they're nations. So Chechen and Gush peoples right here. This peoples, to them, the Narts are very... they're not necessarily considered ancestors. They're more almost divine creatures. And there's an interesting parallel between the way that they view their epic stories and the Scandinavian epic stories that we all know about, the Eddas and the sagas. Also, the pantheon of the Scandinavian peoples. So Shatana in the Chechen and Gush language, and I'm sorry, I apologize terribly to anyone who may be from those places, any of these places, for butchering the proper words horribly and maybe misapplying them to a particular group. That's not my intention. I'm not an expert on Caucasus as far as I don't speak any of the languages, so I apologize in advance. My intentions are pure, I swear. But so Shatana is known as Sela Sata. Now, in those languages, anytime you have a person's name, the father's name is always a component of a person's name. So, for example, a name like Sela Sata means Sata, daughter of Sela. Now, we remember the story in the beginning of this whole epic tale about how a beautiful girl got lured out of living in the depths of the sea, and she married one of the two twin brothers, but they both wound up dying, etc., etc. Much stuff happened. She promised herself to this god. The god really wanted her. She tricked him, and then so when she died and her sons failed to watch her grave properly, the god basically brought her back to life, copulated with her, got her pregnant, and then made her dead again. And as a result of that, Shatana was born. We remember that story, right? Well, that story seems to remain. So in any version of the story, Satana or Selasata, or whatever, Shatana, whatever you want to call her, she's always has this kind of dark divine birth. She is of the Narts on the one hand, but she's not of the Narts on the other hand, because her father is a deity, and her mother was dead at the time she was conceived. Now, Sela in the Chechen and Gush mythology was a god of thunder, and the story is pretty much the same. But in that mythology, rather than being an absent and very negative figure, Sela is actually overseeing his daughter throughout her existence. He actually gives her a magical ring, And this magical ring allows her to communicate either with the ring itself or with her father, or with her father's wisdom whenever she needs to ask a question. She doesn't know how to solve a situation. She has this magical little, basically, Siri with her all the time. You know, she can always ask, hey, Siri, how do I overcome a giant? Hey, Siri, how do I help these people? Moreover, another interesting parallel happens in their tales. I mean, there's some parallels with the Scandinavian mythology. There's some parallels with the Greek mythology. So we remember that in the Ascetan version, Shatana wound up marrying her brother. But in this mythology, she actually married the sun god, the god of sun. And the way that happened, according to legend, is that there was a competition. Basically, there were two most beautiful women, and the god of the celestial god could not figure out which one he wanted for his wife. And so he called for competition. Both girls had to compete, and they had to make really fine clothing for all the living Narts, 64 of them, and some stories, other numbers and others. Bottom line is Satasella, using the ring that her father gave her and her own amazing domestic skills, she went much ahead of her competitor, and she wound up winning the honor of becoming the wife of the deity. And so she's not only the daughter of a deity, she's also a wife of a deity, which is an interesting thing because Saslan himself, her brother that she winds up marrying in some of the other folklore or some of the other epic stories, is oftentimes associated with the sun god due to some of his properties. For example, the whole idea of him being born from the stone, I'm not going to go into the long magical fairy tales theory, but there's some indications that Saslan may have indeed originally been a combination of an actual epic hero and some sort of a basically sun deity or celestial deity. So even though the stories are different, but the motifs overlap in both, but that competition where she had to show her skills as somebody who can make fabric, somebody who can make fine clothing out of fabric, is very similar to the way that Athena oftentimes is associated with the loom. She's oftentimes associated with civilization. She's oftentimes associated with the competition in weaving fabrics and so on and so forth. Another aspect that makes them similar-ish, I'm not sure how significant it is, the fact that they are both were basically born. They're children only of their father because their mother is long since dead by the time they came about to be. Now, of course, Athena was born out of Zeus's head because he did indecent things to her mother. The birth of Shatana or Selasata from a dead mother, basically newborn in a cemetery, is kind of also fairly mystical, a kind of ominous idea. So both of those female characters have only one parent, and it's their father figure. The name for Saslan, the main hero, one of the main heroes of these epic cycles, and that Saslan is Seskos Solsa, which means made of steel. I mean, and the only difference between the Chechen and Gush stories and the stories of the Ossetian people is that in those stories, he was not the husband of Shatana. He was actually somebody who found her, wound up raising her. So that's but either way, those two characters are very tightly connected. Their familiar relationships may be a little bit different, but they're still connected. And then there's, of course, another member of this family, and I do want to pull up his picture. So here comes our Trickster. And this is a guy who causes all the problems. His name is Sirdon. He has different names in different, again, legends. This is the guy who is at the center of all the troubles and all the problems, and in the end becomes the reason for the downfall and the death of the Narts. He is also a half-brother of the main character in all of the legends of Saslan. Sirdon is, in some of the stories, is the one who hears their crying. He's the one who's always tricked and mistreated by all the other Narts. He is the one who lives off to the side. He's the wily, he's a warlike, but he's also cheater, stealer, trickster, sayer of nasty things. He's the one who causes, for example, Saslan needs not to be, weapon proof, when the rest of Saslan's body is made impervious to blows from various weapons. By passing, he's constantly walking in the midst of a crowd, dropping a word or two here, causing much disarray and much dislike between peoples, and leading to death, destruction, mayhem, and other various not good things. But he's also a tragic hero because on the one hand, I mean, he's shown as a negative hero. There's a scene, for example, in some of the tales where the Narts, after having feasted much, have come across a time of much hunger, and they're literally dying of starvation. And he has much herds and he has much food, and so he's sitting on the hilltop, laughing at them and throwing bones to them and not sharing his food. But by the same token, when the Narts, again, in some of the stories, for various reasons, either because he did this to them, or because they generally were just being early heroes, that the Narts, they break into his house and kill his sons. I mean, in some stories he has only one beloved son, in some stories it's more than one son. In some stories it's a very archaic story of when they chop the children up and feed them to the father. Bottom line is, or at least attempt to feed them to the father. Bottom line is, in all of the stories, he loses his sons whom he loves very much. And when this happens, he's so bereaved by his grief that he winds up inventing beautiful music and singing such beautiful and noble songs that the Narts are completely touched and they are just torn. And he made this instrument that he was playing on. Fandir is what it's called. It's 12 string fandir. He made it out of according to some stories, of the bones of his dead children. But at the same token, this is a hero who is responsible for the death of the Narts eventually. So there's some parallels we can see here with the Scandinavian folklore. I mean, first of all, and another one of his aspects, he can take any shape. He's very clever. He almost always uses his wits rather than his strength or might or warrior skills to basically reach his goal. But he's very similar to Loki in the sense that on the one hand, he is closely related to the main characters of the Narts saga stories. On the story about the fact that his children are killed, the fact that he's capable of taking on a feminine shape, and he's also the only Nart magician, or if you want to call them a male witch, which is something very akin to Scandinavian sagas, Scandinavian divine stories. And he's the one who is going to bring about the end of the Narts. I mean, in this case, not the end of the world, but at the very least, the end of the Narts as such. So what do you guys want to do first? Do you want to look at a couple more peoples with their different legend styles, or do you want to look at the death of the Narts?
Interesting. We often hear origin stories of peoples, but this is also an ending story, or at least an ending of a cycle, which is an interesting thing. You don't often hear that in legend.
So Adigi people, they were fairly numerous, and a lot of them lived on, unlike the other peoples we're talking about, a lot of these people lived more on the flatlands. They lived on the plains, at the foothills of the mountains. And their stories, their version of the Nartic epic stories is very different from the Ossetian, but very similar to the people in Abkhazia. So the Adygea is right here. So the Adigi people, first of all, the very interesting thing about them is that these people seem to have, before the advent of Christianity or any other monotheistic, really monotheistic religions, they already had the concept of an ancient, of a god, of a single deity, then one that's in some languages is referred to as Tha. And this is a deity that permeated everything around them. So the world in itself is made of Tha. Tha is the world. Tha is all-knowing. And Tha is the one who has established the morals and the regulations by which people lived. And Nathan, you were saying something about how these stories show how you interact with wild nature and how you interact with your environment, but they also show how you interact with people within the society. So there's certain standards of being decent to your elders, taking care of your family members, not lying unless it's a military strategic need, being heroic, not being a coward, having a sense of dignity, having a sense of keeping your word, things like that. All these things were necessary in order for any one of these peoples and any of these groups to be considered a decent member of society, to even be accepted as a part of the society. So these epic stories, different as they may be for each group, they define their morality to this day. This is a key thing to understand, that every boy and every girl growing up, just like our story, our morality is permeated by Christian or other stories, whatever traditions, maybe Muslim or some other Buddhist people were brought up, and their entire mentality is very much the idea of right and wrong, the idea of fair and unfair, the idea of noble and ignoble. All of that is deeply permeated by the examples from the Nartic tales, which they hear in the forms of fairy tales, in the forms of various sayings, proverbs, since early age. But an interesting thing with the Ka is that if somebody is, for example, going against these standards and has a really good reason to do so, a reason that they themselves believe to be pure, they can pray to the God, to their high God, and explain why they're acting against the morals of the peoples. And it is assumed that they will not be punished for it, that they will not be in any way penalized for it. But by the same token, their idea of afterlife is very interesting, and the idea of afterlife is not so much about physical suffering like it is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The idea is that a soul of a person who did not adhere to this code of honor, who did not adhere to these social traditions and proper decent treatment of other people after their death, rather than enjoying afterlife and having fun, they're going to sit there and suffer horribly from guilt and self-loathing. So that's their version of punishment and hell, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
I actually do have a question. I might have asked last time, but in the epic cycle, the epic story, as I think it was Chris mentioned, how it's also an ending story. Is that kind of similar to the concept of Ragnarok?
Yes and no, because Ragnarok is the end of all creation and rebirth of all creation, to where the Nartic stories is the Narts that are. It's, you know what it's most similar to? It's most similar to the Greek Trojan War and the Oedipus, to where all the heroes, all the Greek heroes, the generation of heroes gets wiped off the face of the planet. In other words, the heroes have to move and be gone so that peoples of our day can populate the earth. So it's much more similar to that. But in a sense, it is kind of similar to Ragnarok. So I think I'm going to just end this really. I'm going to end the whole story with the death of the Narts. But before that, I just want to talk about some very interesting traditions, because other gay peoples, about them, probably not counting the Ascetic people, the most, for various reasons, I was able to find the most information about various rituals and folk memories and how things were done all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century. Some of these traditions survived. So I mentioned the single God. Well, it's not the single God, it's the supreme God. In the tradition of the other gay people, there's also a reference to something very similar to the Father Sky that you have in the Mongolian tradition. And my personal opinion is that this idea of this ever-present entity that is the sky above, that is not necessarily a goddess, and it does not have a personified humanoid appearance, but it is the greater spirit above that's always watching, may have been something that went through the Scythian tradition into the Mongolian and other Turkic people's traditions, and also left its imprint on some of these peoples from Caucasus, because they did have a lot of interaction with the Scythian peoples, with the Sarmatian peoples, and so on and so forth. But they do have that concept, and it remains today in the culture, to where one can swear, you know, like we say, I swear by God. You know, I swear on my mother's grave, they say, I swear by the great sky. So that tradition remains. Then I wanted to go into a little bit into depth about a couple other interesting traditions. One is the tree cult. It's not quite the proper title, the tree culture. So Cherkess, Adig peoples, up until fairly recently, maintained the memory of the fact that they saw tree groves, certain tree groves, and most tree groves as sacred. First of all, there was a limitation on how many trees you could take from there. Each tree grove back in the days used to have a family that was a guardian family for that tree grove. And the trees oftentimes, again, back to the subject of totems, were viewed as their ancestors or connected to their ancestors. So chopping down a tree was considered to be something akin to committing a sacrilege. And there remains some echoes of pre-Christian, pre-Muslim, pre-anything monotheistic traditions that said that their main, the most important rituals would be conducted in tree temples. In other words, because that region is well known for their fruit trees. There's a lot of fruit trees planted everywhere. Some of them wild. So I will come back to that. Some of them are acculturated, but they are not cut down. They're left alone, and so they grow and grow and grow. And even after they die, they form almost like a natural wood temple. And that is where it was considered to be preferable to conduct any important ritual for the community, and not indoors. Even far into Christian, far into Muslim, far into communist times, quite frankly. Some of these rituals are still practiced today. Some of them as vestigial rituals, some of them were practiced as recently as 50 years ago. So the things that went with the idea of the trees were seen as ancestors. And remember I mentioned that the Abkhazian people used to have the tradition of burying their dead, their very important dead, not every dead person, in the trees, in the sense that the body would be placed into a coffin and attached to a tree, which kind of harkens to the idea of Odin, who pins himself to the tree. I mean, that whole idea that through a tree, through a connection to a tree, you can raise up, or you can have, or the idea in the Game of Thrones, as they talk about the tree internet, right? That whole concept that by connecting to a tree, by becoming a part of a tree, not only is there idea of growth and rebirth and living forever, but you can also it's an elevator to the heavens. A tree is an elevator to the heavens. So what they would do, that's what is now. This is gathered information from many different sources, not necessarily accurate. The idea is that the body would be placed into a coffin. The coffin would be attached to a tree, be hung from a tree, and the family would come there every year and celebrate with the deceased. Until the body rotted away, was picked clean by wild animals. And that's a hearkening to very ancient tradition. There seems to have been a tradition like that also in the Abkhazian peoples.
Also, the northwest coast of Canada and Alaska, like the Haida people, they would put their dead on what they call it a bone box up on a pole or a tree. That's exactly, and of course the animals would come and pick at the flesh and stuff, and that's what they do.
Do you know what ritual meaning they attach to that particular practice? Do you know what mentality went behind it? Do you have any idea?
I actually don't. I just know that was done, and one of the ideas is things are made of wood, and then like a totem pole and whatnot, they're not preserved, and they're sort of designed to rot away. Like they'll last maybe 100 years, 200 years, but as they rot away, they're just left to rot, and that's part of the culture.
Right. You see, and I've heard that too about certain groups in America. A lot of plains tribes also had similar things, as we know that the Zoroastrian tradition had that idea. So that makes me, again, this is my guess that just crossed my mind. Now it's not supported by anything, but it makes me wonder if something like that harkens back to way back in time, before those groups even split up, because it would make sense before people had shovels, before they figured out how to bury their dead in the ground, even though Neanderthals were already doing it. But maybe that's some echo of that tradition of leaving the body away from the camp on the one hand and making it, but by understanding what meaning they put in there, the fact that they come back there to celebrate with the deceased year after year, the fact that they consider because they would place those bodies not in any trees, those trees were within the same sacred groves. So all of that stuff is interconnected. The idea of the trees as your ancestors, the idea of sacred groves that you don't mess with, the idea of burying your dead in the trees. Later, that turned into a tradition where they would actually build like a smallish, comparing to skit in Kurgan, and bury the dead as close up to the sky as possible. And then towards the beginning of the 20th century, it turned into an idea where just the clothing of a person who has passed away, their objects of routine use, their weapons would be hung up on a tree as an offering. So it's like an echo of that same tradition, but it was still lingering fairly recently. And then another thing that is very interesting, that is no longer unfortunately the case, is when, Soviet Union and all that stuff. I mean, when the first explorers, late explorers of the Tsars, Imperial Russia, and then the Soviet Union, bottom line is they would be walking through the wild tree groves, like just wild trees growing forests on the side of the hill somewhere in the region of Cherkessia, and they would suddenly find amazing fruit, like apples and plums or whatever other fruit. It's because there was a tradition that every person who went out into the woods at the right time of the year took a little piece of, basically what they did is they transplanted onto the wild fruit trees their domesticated fruits, so the entire forest became one big fruit bearing locale. So it was pretty amazing when people would just go into when people from Russia at the time and other people from Eastern Western Europe, they thought that maybe that's how it just was normal, but that wasn't normal. It's because for generations, people had this tradition of acculturating the wilderness around them, not just by cutting it down, but by also replanting the ability to bear fruit, making it a domestic, so taking a wild environment and without destroying it, domesticating it. And I thought that was a really fascinating idea. The other tradition that I want to talk about, a couple of them, one has to do with lightning, one has to do with water, and the two are interconnected. So lightning, the idea of somebody being struck by lightning in a lot of cultures is considered to be a punishment. In cultures of other gay people, again, up until even modern days, some people keep that tradition. A person struck by lightning is considered to be holy. It's a holy being, and being struck by lightning is a sign of being specially favored by the god of lightning, or by gods in general. So a person who is killed by lightning, it is forbidden to mourn them. They are buried in special burials, sometimes right at the location where they've been killed by lightning. Moreover, their entire family after that is considered to be basically a family of saints. Not only are they treated with reverence, but they participate in some certain very essential community rituals that are oftentimes connected with water and rain, and especially young girls and children and so forth, women. And to this day, those families are revered. Now, if a person, I mean, there's a story, for example, about a Red Army soldier who was coming home after being drafted to the army, whatever, just nothing, routine stuff, was crossing a bridge, got struck by lightning, and now his whole family is revered, I mean, to this day. So this idea that lightning is not a sign of being punished, lightning is a sign of being special and elect. Moreover, if a tree is struck by lightning, that tree is considered to be especially holy, and they try to take little pieces of it, making magical amulets and so on and so forth out of pieces of that tree without damaging it. And connected with it is the ritual, which I've listened to interviews with multiple people from the area, people who are very much not whatsoever shamanistic. They're not new age minded, they're not particularly mystically minded, they're just normal everyday people. Some of them were very Soviet people, those people were pretty much religious atheists. The idea of the ritual of bringing on the rain. So if they have a year when the rain is really poor, there's this idea of a connection between the sea, and there's a certain holy lake that's in that region. And that lake, the sea is the father, the lake is the son. And so the idea is if they're not having rain, they pick out a person in the village who is considered to be the most righteous person. That person has to go up with a jug or a couple of jugs up to the very top of the mountains, to that very far and hard to reach lake, gather up some water, walk all the way back to the village without spilling the water on the ground or ever setting the jug down. And then everybody in the village needs to partake of that water, wash in it, or there's stories even about like old men, 60s, sitting under a tree, retirees, and the kids in the village running by and splashing that water on them, and them not getting mad because it's a part of the ritual. But there's an important point to that ritual: you do not, under any circumstances, pour that water into a lake or into a river, because if God's forbid, or even a stream, because if God's forbid you do so, that's going to cause flooding and various other atmospheric calamities. And there's actually an interesting story from more or less, late 20th century Soviet Union, when the son of a kolkhoz, I don't know how many of you know what a kolkhoz is, but it was basically a Soviet idea of collective farm where everybody worked together. And it's a very atheistic Soviet organization. So the head of a kolkhoz, the elected head of the kolkhoz, his son was elected to go to the top of the mountain and bring down the water for the water ritual. And because the son didn't, he was like 30-something year old, didn't believe in any of this. He brought down the water, but because it was late when he got down, he just dumped it out into the local stream. Well, the next morning, lo and behold, the collective farm got washed away. And when his father found out what his son has done, he went, oh my gosh. And he started running around saying, don't you dare tell anyone about it, because then our family is going to get blamed for the damage to the socialist property. We're going to be taken to court. And the story didn't come out for many, many, many years. But there have been multiple documented cases when the ritual works and works and works and works to this day. It's conducted regularly now. Usually it's, people who are like working age people that don't participate, but the kids and the elderly in the village all participate in this ritual. And there have been cases where even, Soviet local government or members of TV crew showed up there to film something and were absolutely amazed by how well this ritual works, like a clock, basically. So that's another interesting creature.
We do things like that today. Like, how many of us have gone by a well and not tossed a coin in? That's basically worshiping a Celtic goddess that's pre-Christian, but that the tradition of it still continues to this day.
Well, yeah, it's generally just worship. Basically offering to the spirit of the water, basically, whatever type of water we might be talking about. And then another interesting thing that I wanted to share with you is the idea of how a Vedic tradition dealt with smallpox and pox in general. So this is a ritual of adopting the pox. So back in the day, if a family member wound up getting exposed to the pox and got ill, rather than mourning and crying, again, it's that idea of being selected by the gods, being the chosen one. They would open up their house, they would bake special bread, they would invite the plague, the pox into them. By the plague, I don't mean the clinical definition, I mean like the illness into their home. All the family members would pay, and this person who was sick, they would gather around and sing special songs and start respectfully addressing, basically Mistress Pox, and invite her into the house and pass around the bread and adopt the pox into the family. In other words, attach the pox to the family rather than push it away. And the idea of making it not angry with them to where it would try to punish them, or it was seen as a female. But an interesting thing, and of course afterwards either the person who was sick would die or not die, people would die or not die around them. But here's an interesting thing. Some of the European travelers traveling through that region, even the late 19th, early 20th century, saw an interesting phenomenon to where it seemed that the Adigi had invented independently from the Western doctors the idea of vaccination against pox. For example, they would use special kind of amulets in the bed of the deceased person, and they would, after the illness had passed, expose each other a little bit to that. They also, from what I understand, had noticed that the people who dealt with cows a lot did not necessarily get as ill when the pox came around, and they utilized that to their advantage. That subject is still being researched, but the matter of fact it remains is that a lot of European advanced travelers going to that region were just absolutely shocked at how resistant to the pox that population seemed to have been due to their rituals.
Yeah, cowpox was a very big help, actually, I understand, in developing the later modern smallpox vaccine, because they noticed that people that got cowpox didn't die of smallpox.
Right. And some peoples were even smart enough to use that in their ritualistic approach. Now, a little bit more about the Abkhazian people and how they're, just as a conduit, and some of the other commonalities between practices and rituals and beliefs of some of these peoples. So we talked about wolf as being the totemic animal. Chechen peoples consider themselves to be descendant from the wolf, like wolf is directly their ancestor. In Chechen language, from what I understand, there's no difference between the word wolf and the word dog. It's the same word. And there's some interesting accounts that have been gathered in the Abkhazian region, which is a whole opposite side of Caucasus, about the fact that the Abkhazian herders for the longest time used wolves and not dogs as their basically domesticated canines. And also there's this legend that the sheep, for example, originally they were not created for humans, they were created for the wolves to consume. And humans, by trickery and mischief, stole this right away from the wolves. And so the wolves, when they come and they take some of the herd, they do it perfectly rightfully so, because it was originally their herd. And so in a lot of these peoples, particularly in Abkhazia, there was a kind of a tradition at a certain time of the year to chase a certain, like some percentage of the herd off into the woods for the wolves, or in some cases for the wild kind of deities or spirits that lived in that region, basically to share your herd with the wild wilderness. That idea that if we as humans can only take so much, we can't have everything, we have to share some of our most precious goods, and that's meat, right? That's our herd animals. So that's an interesting thing. And of course, the wolf motif, I mean, here and there and everywhere it goes through all of these stories, very much so. So we've talked about the Scandinavian connection, but we've talked a bunch, I mean, the creation, first of all, the creation story, just very interesting. There's not a creation story, there's a world making story, if that makes sense. So the world shaping story. So in the Adigean folklore, very faint echoes remain that some sort of a net was knit that was tossed, and somehow this gooey substance that was neither liquid nor solid was captured and eventually started to congeal, and it congealed into the world the way that it is. And so that's the idea of creation. And then, of course, the story of Prometheus, which is permeates all of these Caucasian cultures. And of course, before that, it was way before there was a story of Prometheus. But the idea that there was some sort of a hero, in some cases it's a Nart, in some cases it's some other hero who, by basically thievery and mishap, took the fire away from the gods and brought it down to people and was punished again by either being tied up in a cave, or in some cases being tied up in a place. And again, the idea of an eagle that comes and eats the liver or whatever other part of the body of this poor suffering and immortal hero is, and that the chunks of the flesh that fall down is what forms some of the mountain peaks. For example, Elbrus, for example, which is considered to be a holy mountain by a lot of these peoples, not in the same sense as Olympus. Gods don't live on it, but it's the highest place closest to the heavens. And I'm going to stop, see if anybody has anything to say, and then because we're running out of time, just going to really quickly move to the idea of how the Narts died and why the Narts died.
Kind of a brief observation, and there's a lot of reference to the mythology as being an ending story, and that actually there are a lot of parallels with their mythology and storytelling with our Western movie genre, and that you need this incredibly terrible, horrible hero to make this wild, dangerous space safe for civilization. Yet at the end, for civilization,
the hero must die.
Yeah, the hero must die or go away or be sent away, because the hero has qualities that just simply are not compatible with peaceful civilization.
Right.
And so that has to be reconciled somehow.
Right. So a couple of legends, I'm just going to throw out a couple of legends from a couple of different peoples about how the Narts died. So the version number one, an evil entity, fill in the blank. It could be, for example, Sir Don, a poor, mischievous, Loki type character who is always jealous and envious of the Narts because they're always being not very nice to him. They're treating him, quite frankly, quite poorly. They're acting kind of like a bunch of high school bullies towards somebody who is not as mighty as them, and they just always disrespecting him. That he started, he's always involved in the death of the Narts stories, but that he got the poison of a snake, the milk of the goat, and I forget something else from some other unpleasant animal. He mixed all of that, and he poisoned the food that the Narts would be eating at their next feast with this horrible concoction, which poisoned the hearts of the Narts, and it placed inside them, the kind of the treacherous nature of the snake, the jealous nature of the goat. And I forget, the last one was something, a rage of the bull or something like that. Bottom line is, it made them kind of crazy. And so what happened next is that the oldest of the Narts, he has different names, but he's kind of the grandfather, the father warrior, as he's described, the noble, gray-haired, beautiful, and mighty warrior, the patriarch of the family, started feeling lustful for his daughter-in-law, the bride, the bride soon to be wife of his son, who was another great Nartic hero. And so when his son went off to do battle or some heroic deed, he basically tried to kidnap the girl and to persuade her to abandon her marriage to his son and become his mistress or his wife in some different stories. And the girl, in complete outrage, she dropped a ring that her husband gave her, or her husband-to-be gave her, as a sign of her faithfulness, and she ran away screaming. Bottom line is, her beloved found the ring. He knew something was wrong. He came home, found out what his father has done, and then, so of course, he started, drew his sword. The father and son went at war at each other. The Narts, as a group, they split down the middle, and the two armies battled. The poor girl, unable to see this, when her beloved was killed by his own father's hand, she ends up jumping up a cliff or otherwise killing herself. And then bottom line is, the Narts fight each other and they all drop dead, and they have gone from the world because of the jealousy and the trickery of the evil, envious and not very friendly acts of one of them. That just now it occurred to me that, there's a legends how who was it the Scythians, or was it the Cimmerians who were being driven out of their land? The kings, instead of basically running away, they wound up breaking into two groups and started battling each other unto death. So all the leaders, I think it was the Cimmerians.
Was it the Royal Scythians?
No, it was the Scythians drove the Cimmerians out of the thing, and the legend, the Herodotus legend, has bottom line this idea that a tribe, because that has to self-destruct for whatever reason, splits into two halves and does battle onto each other and slays each and every last of each other. It kind of seems to me to be something that also echoes through.
How they became Amazons, don't you?
Yeah, but the other version of the story is slightly a little bit more amusing. Um, the story is this: that having defeated all the dragons, having defeated all the monsters, having defeated all the great warriors, having conquered everything and everyone, the Narts got bored. They were sitting around and going, "We're so cool, we're so tough, we're such great warriors. There's nobody like us. What are we gonna do?" And of course, nearby walks who? Their dear friend Serdon, who says, "Well, Narts, if you don't seem to find any good opponents, how about the gods? You know, you and the gods have had they haven't helped you much. They haven't done that. What do they do for you? You know, you bow down to them. Well, they say, well, okay, if we want to challenge the gods, we'd love to, but how do we go about doing that? They're up there, we are here on the earth." And he says, well, it's no problem. You know, make the doors in your houses taller, so when you cross the threshold, you don't have to bow down. Don't conduct any rituals. Don't show them any respect, because when you bow down, they might think that you're bowing before them. We don't want that. Aha, said the Narts. So they did this thing. Bottom line is the god scratched his head, or gods, depending on the version of the story, and send a messenger. Like in some cases it's a bird, and in some cases it's some sort of an other, oftentimes it's a bird, saying, "Hey Narts, what's going on? Have I not been good to you? Have we not been good to you? Have we not been friendly to you? Why are you disrespecting us?" And the Narts said, "No, you haven't been good or friendly to us. You've been not very useful to us at all. Come on down from up there and we want to do battle on you." And God, aka gods, say, well, we kind of like you, Narts. We really don't have to do battle on you, because if we do battle on you, we're going to kill you. The Narts say, "Ah ha ha, you pathetic little wimps. How, so you're afraid of us? Bring upon us all you might." And God says, "Okay, you guys sure you want me to do this?" They say, "Yeah, we're definitely sure." And okay, says God, and he curses them. And then it goes through a whole series of stories how he made it. So basically, he prevented them from having food. But they kept coming up with tricky ways of getting around it. So, for example, he said that like they would not be able to cut down a single stalk with wheat in it, because just the seeds would fall down and just not function for them. So they used these two-pronged arrows to cut them down without ever touching them. He said that they will never be able to, under the sunlight, they will never be able to gather crops. They started doing it at midnight. Bottom line is this all went on for a while, and then the Nards said, "Wait a minute, what the heck? We wanted to die. We said that we wanted to be eternally gloriously remembered." Now that harkens back to Achilles, right? The idea of living eternally eternally in memory of becoming an old kind of cumbersome man. Also harkens to the Viking tradition. Basically, they said, look, the worst fate a warrior can have is to grow old and feeble. Why are we running away from our fate? We were going to die. And they basically, in a lot of the stories, they either just die, they dig their own graves and jump into them, or in a lot of stories, they drink molten copper and die that way. And yet another version of the death of the Narts is that the Narts wanted to be closer to the gods, and so they tried to climb one upon another to reach to the heavens, to be at the same level as the gods. But no matter how tall they built their tower of peoples, it's the cat's tail lengths that they were not able to reach to the heavens, and they got cursed by the gods. They died. And the last version, and this is probably the latest version, this is the Chechen English version, is that they challenged Allah himself, that they refused to bow down before the Almighty, and that the Almighty therefore either cursed them or forced them to drink the molten copper, which echoes with some of the Muslim traditions of how sinners are treated in the afterlife. Bottom line is, one way or another, they challenged the powers that are stronger and greater than them and died as a result of it. So in all versions of the story, the Narts are dead. They're dead, they're dead, they're dead. And of course, the only one whose death is never mentioned is the immortal, eternal Shatana, Satana, Selasata, the mother, the one who has not actually brought up any children of her own, and yet she was the mother, the wife, the female to all and every Nart throughout the history. So that's pretty much kind of what I wanted. I mean, there's so much material there. If you dig in, like each individual variation has so many just fascinating nuances that's material I could talk about forever. But those parallels with the Scandinavian, with the Iranian, with the just you name it. I mean, Slavic legends, Greco-Roman legends.
And the echoes, like I'm thinking of the Christian, Jewish, Muslim story, the Tower of Babel story, which goes right back to these stories.
And it almost, to me, it seems to almost predate it, because the Tower of Babel was much more culturally advanced. You're building stuff out of, to where these are just people climbing on each other's shoulders. So it almost seems to me a little bit more archaic. So there's so much interesting, there's so many layers of, first of all, there's stories about Narts firing at the gods with cannonballs, for example. So obviously that's a very modern invention. There's metal, there's pre-metal stories, obviously Stone Age motifs. There's some super archaic motifs in these cycles. They're motifs that seem to have given origin to much more complex later classical Greek, classical world motifs. I mean, they just see it's something that is so fascinating to dig in, and the more you learn about it, the more fascinating you become, because it's again back to the thing that Nathan said, the chicken and the egg, right? Which came first? And I would not be surprised if it went every which direction through that kind of region.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because a lot of legends have a basis in history. Like Santa Claus was the Bishop of Myrna in the 2nd century.
Right.
It's been warped a lot since then, but there's a basis for these stories. And so origin stories, that it comes from something that may or may not have actually happened. But having a story for the ending of a culture, that is really interesting. That's kind of rare, actually.
Yeah, well, except for the Greek, where in Greece it's the idea of the end of the age of heroes. That's kind of there in that sense, yeah. But that's pretty much all, guys, I have for now on the Nartic epic stories. And what I want to do is I want to cover some of the other groups of peoples who live in Caucasus, maybe not the next, I don't know, 3-4 episodes, if you guys are not sick of it yet, just because these are so little covered groups. I really want to cover what's known as the Caucasian Albania, which is completely unrelated to Albania elsewhere. The peoples who live there, I mean, this was a fairly large and very advanced state that existed until fairly recently, for example. So I really want to cover their contribution. I really want to quickly go over the people of Dagestan, which we have hardly talked about, which is a completely unique group. And kind of, I mean, we talked a little bit about the Cherkess people. So it's a region that seems to have been right in the middle of trade and of war and of bloody conflict and a lot of controversy for as long as it's existed on this planet. Okay, same place, same time, and thanks, guys. I couldn't do it without you. Much appreciated.
Yeah, great cast. Good to see everybody. Hopefully I'll have video next time. Everybody be well.
You too. Bye-bye, guys. Bye.
Have a good night.
That exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.